So the question I'm going to be addressing today is whether or not a consideration of the global history of psychoanalysis can indeed tell us something about the stakes of neurodiversity and place. And in order to do so, I'm going to be using three rather unusual objects. A psychoanalytic conference from 2000 that was held in Paris, a text by Jacques Derrida, and a 12th century Arabic poem. All right, good. I think the technology is working here. In Jacques Derrida's État d'âme de la psychanalyse, psychoanalysis searches the states of its soul, delivered as an address to an international gathering of analysts at the Sorbonne in 2000, Derrida proposes that any future psychoanalysis should strive towards the horizon of a sovereign cruelty. For Derrida, this names the peculiar position of psychoanalysis at the turn of the millennium, uncomfortably stretched between the intimacy of analysis, globalization, and issues of sovereignty and human rights. To strive toward what he terms the impossible beyond of a sovereign cruelty, l'impossible au-delà d'une souveraine cruauté, would mean, Derrida proposes, for psychoanalysis to embrace responsibility for a hitherto absent engagement with the geopolitical and historical cruelties that structure and have structured its global situatedness. War, genocide, racism, crimes against humanity, the death penalty, and innumerable further traumas of the public sphere. The peculiar forum of Derrida's address, an international gathering of representatives of the psychoanalytic community, is an integral reference point of his text, which later appeared as an independent publication under the same name. Beyond being the context for Derrida's talk, the States General of Psychoanalysis, as the conference was known, is useful to consider in its own right. As an experiment in assessing the implications of globalization for psychological theories broadly writ, the States General of Psychoanalysis is an instructive springboard from which to consider how the concept of neurodiversity does or might consider and address questions of place. What, for example, are the possibilities and pitfalls of a neurodiverse approach when considered beyond the largely Anglophone sites of its genesis? What kind of universal subject does neurodiversity imagine, if any? Does the presupposition of natural genetic variation on which definitions of neurodiversity rely exempt the term from the long philosophical, historical, and political history of naturalness and its associated exclusions? By turning to the ways in which psychoanalysis has and has not addressed place and geography, my goal today is to offer a prelude, a warning, and a provocation to a multinational neurodiversity and its attendant lexicon of difference. Derrida's emphasis on cruelty in his address to the States General is essential, I think, in this regard. It illuminates the ways in which the mind sciences have been both agile global travelers and armchair philosophers imagining their own peculiar global cartographies. Working through what cruelty means in the phrase quoted above, impossible beyond of a sovereign cruelty, is a conduit, I think, to better understanding the discourse of rights and questions of representation at stake in the concept of neurodiversity, and so too, I think, by proxy in psychiatry at large. So then, the inaugural States General of Psychoanalysis was convened by Reilly in Paris in the summer of 2000 with the goal of stimulating a global discussion on the fates and futures of psychoanalysis in the 21st century. To quote from Elizabeth Roudanesco's introduction to the gathering, how should the future of psychoanalysis be considered both in the various countries where it has not yet been rooted and in Europe where it is enjoying new success, notably after the fall of communist regimes? Will the new psychoanalysis of the 21st century be exported to these countries following a post-colonial or globalizing model, or instead will it succeed in becoming a critical instrument, critical at the same time of its own dogmas? And this is a point I will return to in this talk. Critical at the same time of its own dogmas, as well as of those schools of thought which resist its expansion. As Roudanesco's words make clear, the meeting was a unique collective effort by scholars and clinicians to interrogate psychoanalysis' relationship to place. Such an effort is quite different from the two dominant historical modes of psychoanalytic science's international dissemination, the translation of Freud's oeuvre from German and the creation of formal institutional bodies. Secondary scholarship on the question of translation has tended to be directed along a few main lines of inquiry. There's a body of research that addresses the metaphor of translation within Freud's writing. By contrast, psychoanalytic literary critics in the 1980s and 1990s approached the question from the perspective of diagnoses of translation, and in some cases, of the translator. More recently, the rise of translation studies as a field of critical inquiry across the humanities has shored up a set of earlier and ongoing interests in nationally specific legacies of psychoanalysis. In works by Etkin, Gaio, Plotkin, Strenger, and Rice, among others, the dominant formulation tends to be Freud in X location. The linguistic availability of Freud's work to a non-German speaking audience contributed to growth of both national psychoanalytic associations and international congresses. Today, the International Psychoanalytic Association maintains an online list of over 100 regional groups, component societies, and study groups, some of which I've listed here from the website, classified by place. These represent a rather dramatic increase from the 42 predominantly European participants who made up the first International Congress of Psychoanalysis organized by Jung in 1908. You'll see Freud in the center. The gathering at the Sorbonne stands apart then from both of these approaches by virtue of its recognition of an indebtedness and reliance on translation, prior translational activities, and also through its metacritical emphasis on the stakes of internationalization, past and future. Although the States General drew together 1,000 participants from 33 countries, it is also essential not to overlook the explicit and performative Frenchness of the occasion. The title, States General, Les États Généraux, is an open reference to the tripartite assembly of clergy, nobility, and commoners intended to advise the king under the old regime. Still further, it is an evocation of crisis, the revolutionary 1789 States General, during which the Third Estate declared itself a representative of the people, rather than a class-based subsection of the population, and proceeded to form the National Assembly and swear the tennis court oath. Major's act of christening his psychoanalytic iteration with the same name 2 centuries later is a call for psychoanalysis to be more unambiguously engaged in the ethical, juridical, and political issues of the post-World War II era. It is also a recognition, I think, of the potential perils of representation. The gathering is situated uncomfortably, if deliberately, between one, a question of adequate formal representation for constituents of a global psychoanalytic community, increasingly in 2000 connected by the World Wide Web. There was for a time a website that was built around the conference. It no longer exists. And 2, the knowledge that the States General produced its own destruction in 1789 and brought about collapse through the execution of the monarch and the end of an entire system of rule. In short, the States General of Psychoanalysis situates the participants at the crossroads of a past deeply implicated in the history of human rights and an unformulated future that runs the risk of psychoanalysis self-annihilation, if only by analogy. The French title of Derrida's talk is a multifaceted pun on these considerations. It addresses, in a very literal sense, the question of whether or not psychoanalysis has a stable identity and has a stable object. The English rendering of Derrida's title, Psychoanalysis Searches the States of Its Soul, which you'll see on the top line, though innovative, pales in comparison with what the French can be read to imply. If état is taken in the sense of condition, en bon état, in good condition, en mauvais état, in poor condition, the title would mean the conditions of the soul of psychoanalysis. If by contrast état implies state or nation state, one is dealing here with the national composition of the soul of psychoanalysis. Or perhaps an echo of the ancien regime's 3 estates, the estate of the soul of psychoanalysis. There is yet a further possibility. État d'âme, in the plural, can be an idiomatic expression referring to having qualms or hesitations, misgivings, avoir des états d'âme, mixed with a whiff of culpability, even guilt. Hence, a soul-searching, this is where the English comes from, of psychoanalysis, or qualms of psychoanalysis. Derrida's characteristic sustaining of the equivocality between these different positions in his title is symptomatic, I think, of their inseparability. The question at stake that formulates these multiple different senses would be roughly as follows. In what type of condition does psychoanalysis find itself, and what responsibilities does or should it bear, given its national composition and relationship to the state and to state violence? Lurking here is yet an older consideration of the relative universality or lack thereof of the psychoanalytic subject. I read then the body of Derrida's address as a performative staging of several encounters. These are intended to illuminate the possibility that psychoanalysis contains, like the 1789 States General, the dangerous but necessary seed of its own excess and self-transcendence. These are points at which psychoanalysis meets its limit. Freud's emphasis on cruelty, Grausamkeit, and Derrida's reading thereof in his address is, I hope to show, both the name for psychoanalysis' contact with its own beyond, the au-delà, the phrase I mentioned earlier, and the possibility for an alternative universal to that psychoanalytic subject. The beyond here in the phrase impossible beyond of a sovereign cruelty is of course Derrida's reference to Freud's beyond the pleasure principle, jenseits des Lustprinzips, where Freud first proposes the death drive and lays out the basics of a libidinal economy. Derrida opens his address by repeating Freud's gesture of seeking a beyond. My question will be, is there for psychoanalytic thought to come, another beyond, if I can say that, a beyond that would stand beyond these possibilities that are still both the pleasure and the reality principle, and the death or sovereign mastery drives, which seem to be at work wherever cruelty is on the horizon? Yet the address to the States General, Derrida's address to the States General, is also a self-consciously staged address, a greeting, a salutation. It is as much out of the context of its delivery as a pointed attempt to ask how to recognize or hail psychoanalysis. The text is full of references to Derrida's greeting or saluting the States General. He positions himself first as coming from the outside like a stranger. To know how to greet the States General, he must determine the conditions for recognizing the body of assembled representatives, as well as for recognizing psychoanalysis. He writes, "It is by naming the beyond of the pleasure principle, the beyond of the death drive, the beyond of the death drive, the beyond of the drive for sovereign mastery, thus the otherwise impossible, the other impossible or the impossible other, that I would like to salute the States General of Psychoanalysis." In this initial moment of encounter, the act of recognition occurs through a gesture of naming beyond the death drive. This first greeting, however, is nearly immediately interrupted by a second, a knock on the door. Before I begin, assuming that I ever begin, I must settle my choice on two common nouns. They have just struck a knock on the door, or struck period. We will answer them without yet being able to answer for them. They are the nouns cruelty and sovereignty. Why these nouns? Sovereignty refers to what the gathering of the States General put up for grabs, how psychoanalysis has been shaped by the forces particular to sovereign nation states, whether in censorship or embrace, and how it has in turn carved the globe into psychoanalytically identifiable units, witness the institutional divisions of the IPA. Why privilege cruelty, however? As it happens, there's a large set of direct references to cruelty, Grausamkeit, across Freud's works. From Dora through the interpretation of dreams to 3 essays on the history of sexuality and published correspondence with Albert Einstein on the topic Why War in 1932, cruelty names a kind of psychoanalytic limit that is nevertheless internal to Freudian psychoanalysis. It is more than just a synonym for sadism, though the two frequently appear in conjunction in the Freudian corpus. Instead, the mention of cruelty or a cruel gesture in Freud is often the sign of a moment in which psychoanalysis encounters something its own interpretive framework cannot explain. Like the navel of the dream, these instances of cruelty bear no further analysis and are closely related to the death drive and their lust for destruction's sake. As Freud writes famously in The Dream of Irma's Injection, in which he first discusses the navel of the dream, the content of the preceding part of the dream had been my wish that my patient's pains were due to severe organic affection and not a failure of treatment. I had a feeling that I was only trying to shift the blame from myself. Psychological treatment could not be held responsible for the persistence of diphtheritic pains. Nevertheless, I had a sense of awkwardness at having invented such a severe illness for Irma simply in order to clear myself. It looked so cruel. The word is grausam in German. Es sieht so grausam aus. By selecting the word cruelty, Derrida is borrowing directly from Freud and focusing on instances where cruelty seems to be synonymous with an unanalyzable desire for brutality. The fact that the term cruelty also invokes the language of human rights, injunctions on cruel and unusual punishment, is of course no accident given the uniquely named States General and the role of the French Revolution in laying the foundation for the rights of man. That also, however, does not explain the staging of cruelty as an arrival or a knocking. One way I think to account for this would be, of course, to refer back to the famous encounters that Derrida reads of Rousseau in On Grammatology, those moments at which man encounters man and says giant or claims his patch of earth. But I think there's something else at stake, and that offers too easy a route out. Derrida's address intuits the essential role of unexpected encounters in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, whether or not either Derrida or Freud is outwardly cognizant of the connection. You may recall that Beyond the Pleasure Principle does not end with Freud's own words, but with the citation. Only believers who demand that science shall be a substitute for the catechism they have given up, who blame an investigator for developing or even transforming his views. We may take comfort, too, for the slow advances of our scientific knowledge in the words of a poet, Ruckert in the Makamen of Hariri. What we cannot reach by flying, we must reach by limping. The book tells us it is no sin to limp. So the reference here is to the makamas, or assemblies, sessions, or seances, by the Arabic poet Al-Hariri of Basra, a cycle of 50 stories, in verse from the 12th century, each featuring the same two protagonists, a narrator, Al-Harith, and a roguish anti-hero, Abu Zaid. In each of the stories, Al-Harith is tricked by Abu Zaid into misrecognizing him. These various scenes of misrecognition are an opportunity for Abu Zaid to demonstrate his exceptional eloquence and wide-ranging knowledge of literature and culture that ultimately reveal his identity, though typically not before having tricked his interlocutors, and Al-Harith in particular, out of some of their worldly possessions. The makamas were originally translated into German in the 1820s by Friedrich Ruckert, who is the subject of the citation by Freud, a poet and professor of Oriental languages at the University of Erlangen. The lines that Freud cites at the conclusion of Beyond the Pleasure Principle are taken from the end of the third makama, or the makama of the coin. In it, Abu Zaid appears before Al-Harith and to a group of his friends disguised as a lame beggar. Taking pity on the careworn, disabled man, Al-Harith offers him a coin on the condition that he prays it in verse on the spot. The flood of elegant and inspired poetry that Abu Zaid produces so impresses Al-Harith and his friends that they offer a second coin, this time on the condition that the lame beggar condemn money. He does so and is hobbling away in satisfaction with his winnings when Al-Harith realizes the trick and calls him out by his name. The play on metrical and physical feet. The play is on metrical and physical feet. The implication that the fleetness of Abu Zaid's tongue has given away the falseness of his stumbling gait. His tongue's metrical mastery reveals the lie of his physical feet. Approaching Abu Zaid, Al-Harith demands to know why he has feigned a limp. In Ruckert's German version of the text, Abu Zaid replies as follows, title page. So I'll read this in German, you can follow along in the English, but I think it's important to hear what the rhyme is. Ich hinke doch nicht aus Vergnügen am Hinken, ich hink zu essen, ich hink zu trinken, ich hinke, wo Sterne der Hoffnung mir winken, ich hinke, wo Gülden entgegen mir blinken. Was man nicht erfliegen kann, muss man erhinken. Viel besser ist hinken, als völlig zu sinken. Die Schrift sagt, es ist keine Sünde zu hinken. So Freud, of course, excerpts or removes the line between. It is far better to limp than to fall entirely, leaving only the line before that and then the last line. It would be easy, I think, to read this conclusion exclusively in terms of a cliché Orientalism. Having offered the tantalizing possibility that the pleasure principle seems actually to serve the death instincts, Freud nevertheless acknowledges that his findings raise questions which can at present find no answer. He pushes off the issue onto a need for further research and fresh methods. The quotation from Ruckert rounds off the piece in a decorous aesthetic flourish for lack of any other conclusion, and with the added benefit of a dash of timeless, mystical, Eastern wisdom. Such a reading, I think, however, overlooks the ways in which the tale tells the story of an encounter with the beyond. Abu Zaid comes as a stranger to the intimate, friendly circle of Al-Harith and his companions. He disrupts their conversation. as much with his arrival from an outside as by virtue of his shabby dress, which contrasts with theirs and his limp. Ruckert's German heightens the sense of an inside and an outside by pointing out the men's metaphorical circle of friendship is also a very real boundary. I've transliterated here from the German Fraktur. There hasn't been a republication of these, and so you'll see the German transliteration on top. The point is the first set of lines. I lingered with happy companions, surrounded by their congenial ring, which includes conviviality and courtesy, and kept out disagreement. Ruckert's German heightens the sense of inside and outside by pointing out that the men's metaphorical circle of friendship is also a very real boundary, one designed to enclose, umschließen, courtesy and conviviality, and exclude or preclude, ausschließen, disagreement. As in the case of Derrida addressing the States General of Psychoanalysis, each group must determine how to greet one another and on what terms. An act of recognition is required. Yet Abu Zaid exceeds and disrupts the established binary of the circle, which, if one wished to speak in Schmittian terms, is the circumference of the friend-enemy distinction. Abu Zaid's unanticipated and unanticipatable arrival among men does not bring discord, but neither does he fully belong among him. There's a superb illustrated manuscript, which is what this illustration is taken from, of the Makamen. Let's see. The limping, which first secured his ability to cross the threshold of the circle, he is not a threat and can be pitied, is also an occasion for a final flight of verse. These are the lines that Freud quotes. The limp thus paradoxically secures both a right of entry by its marked difference and produces the conditions for its own overcoming. Having shown the fleetness of his tongue, Abu Zaid needs no longer hobble and can affirm the ruse while yet defending its use. Although Freud does not recognize it, I think, his conclusion with the lines from Al-Hariri shows the point at which the text of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and perhaps psychoanalysis too, opens itself to its own limit, a point of potential self-destruction. The text quite literally includes the scene of encounter from an incalculable beyond, in the figure of Abu Zaid, who comes, known and yet unknown, from outside the circle of familiarity. Freud, trapped in the Orientalist genres of his time, of course, could do little more than offer this 12th century Arabic, these 12th century Arabic verses in 19th century academic German. He had little access to their original idiom or context. He uses them, I think, in fact, as a crutch for his own limping through the end of the work, which that he recognizes he does not yet know how to conclude. He seeks and finds comfort in the words of Al-Hariri. And yet, as in the narrative of the Makama of the coin, Freud's limping, problematic gesture of citing the lines from that Orientalist position is the very thing that would seem to unaccountably open beyond the pleasure principle to contact with something that is not restricted to the mere beyond of the psychoanalytic death drive. Derrida calls this thing cruelty as a way of recognizing how cruelty, Grausamkeit, is so frequently associated with finding a limit in Freud, an account for that which psychoanalysis cannot account. If one is willing to follow Derrida and Al-Hariri here, and I admit that that may be a big if, but if one is willing, the conclusion might run to the effect psychoanalysis is unique in offering the conditions for its own supersession, much like the meeting of the 1789 States General, which gathered to give birth to its own unforeseen, unanticipatable death. Psychoanalysis opens the door for a critique of psychoanalysis. The phrase, the impossible beyond of sovereign cruelty, describes a picture of psychoanalysis' potential futurity that is not dependent on any specific action taken by the 2000 Assembly in Paris, formation of a new subdivision, focus on a particular geopolitical conflict, nomination of one or another director, but rather on the prior inbuilt structure of the psychoanalytic project in ways that it is not itself even cognizant of. On that model, the question of the neurodiversity paradigm is whether it does or could contain the same nascent kernel of its own limit, and whether it does or could be open to a completely unanticipated moment of encounter. Although there is no question that human minds and brains are different, indeed infinitely variant, the danger, I think, is that the language of universality may not be as neutral or even as positive as it appears at first glance. It is tempting, I think, to endorse wholeheartedly the formulation by writers such as Harvey Bloom in his 1998 introduction to the term neurodiversity in the Atlantic. Quote, neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment, unquote. Yet the catch would seem to lie in the unproblematized question of life in general, the language of naturally occurring cognitive variations, or in Steve Silverman's final chapter of his book, Neurotribes, titled Designs for a Neurodiverse World, the proposition that neurodiversity advocates propose that instead of viewing this gift as an error of nature, society should regard it as a part of humanity's genetic legacy. To be clear, it is indisputable and non-negotiable that such approaches are preferable to stigmatize, pathologize, labeling systems that suggest deviation from the norm. Yet the language of rights I hope to suggest here, in perhaps its most robust formulation, would also seem to mandate, or at very least to strive towards, those systems that take account of the inevitable cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, and national specificity of their epistemological positions, rather than settling for a monolith of genetic legacy. After all, it is designs for the world, or perhaps better said, the states of the world, that are at stake. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University.